Major funding for Odyssey was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Polaroid Corporation.
Please come to order. Today we have as a special treat a guest speaker, Margaret Mead. She is a pioneer in the field work of anthropology. She is a curator emeritus of the American Museum of Natural History. She has many publications, among one of her most famous, The Coming of Age in Samoa. Margaret Mead is a Renaissance woman, a pioneering anthropologist, a writer, a humanist, a woman of brilliance, wit, and infinite knowledge, and we are indeed honored to have this great woman with us today, Margaret Mead.
When Margaret had her mind made up, she could move mountains.
I'm not talking about an angel, I'm talking about a person.
I thought, well, if she could do it in New Guinea, I can certainly do it here.
Now, some societies decide all men are to be like lions and all women are to be like rabbits. When they do that, the lionesses don't do very well.
Now, what Margaret did, I would say, was to begin the sexual revolution.
I think Margaret was the grandmother of the women's movement.
Margaret was a woman before she was anything else, and she was a mother and the family, and ultimately youth, were her major concerns. This is where society is built.
Now, at this moment in history, the United States is the richest and strongest country in the world. It is the country that is endangering the world most, and it's the country that has the greatest chance to save the world.
When Margaret Mead died in 1978, she had spent the first part of her life attempting to save remote tribal cultures from an encroaching modern world, and the second part attempting to save the modern world from itself. She crossed boundaries of time, place, and culture, and returned from her fieldwork with lessons about our own possibilities. What was her mission? What was her method? What was the message she shared with us? She began her journey in 1901 in Philadelphia. Her family moved to a farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, when Margaret was 10. She was the eldest child of Edward Sherwood Mead, a university teacher and businessman, and of Emily Fogg Mead.
My mother was a sociologist who made the first study of Italian immigrants in this country. My grandmother, my father's mother, who lived with us, had been a school teacher, but with very little education, which was true in those days. And then when my grandfather came home from the Civil War, he took his bonus and they both went to college together and graduated together. So that the two women who were closest to me had obviously married, had children, and had professional careers. So that it never occurred to me that women shouldn't have brains. It never occurred to me that you didn't use them, or that you didn't make some selection of a career that you wanted that was more than just being married and having children.
Following a family tradition, Margaret's mother filled 17 notebooks with observations about Margaret and her brother Richard. Very early, Margaret learned from her grandmother to note the differences between her sisters Elizabeth and Priscilla. Although her family were not churchgoers, Margaret found what would be a lifelong faith when she decided at 11 to be baptized at the Buckingham Episcopal Church.
I started thinking about what I might do when I was, I suppose, about 10 or 11. One point I wanted to be a nun. Another point I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a minister's wife and run a small country parish. At the same time, I had 6 children.
When she was 16, Margaret met Luther Cressman, who was bound for the ministry.
I remember we were skating on the French Creek, and she and I skated together for a long, long time, and I told her all about Antigone, which we just read in Greek, and they recited the whole sorry tragedy to her. She had with her this other girl, a close friend, who was a great source of laughter herself, always having fun, you know. She was a good foil for Margaret. Except Margaret was a much more serious person.
Luther did his army service and began studies for the ministry, and Margaret went to college, first at DePauw and then at Barnard College in New York City. A 5-year engagement led to marriage in September of 1923 at the church in Buckingham.
I think Margaret had a very real, genuine interest at the time when she expressed that she wanted to be the wife of a parish priest and mother of 6 children. And I think that her loss of interest in that, when she ran into anthropology, indicates while it was something she was genuinely interested in, it was more or less fantasy.
Margaret first studied English and then psychology, but she found her calling when she took a course with Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology. Boas's urgent concern was to send students out to observe and record those cultures that were vanishing through contact with Western religion and technology. He was skeptical of general theories about behavior and believed that the only way to understand human diversity was through detailed documentation of people living in different times, places, and social circumstances. His student, Ruth Benedict, was interested in the way people grew up to reflect the variations in their cultures. Together, Boas and Benedict influenced Margaret profoundly.
I had already started virtually a master's essay in psychology. And I remember having lunch with Ruth, and she said, well, Professor Boas and I have nothing to offer except the most important work that needs to be done.
Margaret had prepared herself for fieldwork in Polynesia, but Boas was afraid to let her go off alone to a remote island and suggested she study an American Indian group. They compromised.
I went to Samoa because my professor said that I had to go somewhere where there was a boat every 3 weeks. So Samoa had a boat every 3 weeks, so that's where I went.
She had never been west of Indiana. By train and steamer, she traveled 6 weeks and 8,000 miles and landed in Samoa on August 11th, 1925. She was 23 years old. With her, Margaret brought a typewriter, a Junior Kodak camera, pencils, and paper.
Samoa was the perfect island for the problem that I was going to study.
The problem was whether a turbulent adolescence was a universal biological fact, as Hall and Freud said at the time, or whether it was variable, so that children growing up in other cultures might experience a calmer adolescence. While learning the language and recording the environment in which the children developed, Mead observed, interviewed, and tested 68 girls aged 9 to 20 in 3 neighboring villages. She discovered a very different kind of adolescence among the girls of Samoa. They experimented with sex. They were not pushed to achieve or to make adult choices. Extended families cushioned any strain between the child and her parents.
And I could have gone to other islands where adolescence would have looked much like our own. I could have done just as good work, but it wouldn't have interested anybody. It would just have reconfirmed their prejudices.
When she returned, Mead was hired by the American Museum of Natural History in New York City.
And this office has been my most permanent home since 1926, when I came back from Samoa. But I discovered very quickly that this was a very good place to stay. There are 2 stairways. If you don't want to see somebody who's coming up one, you can go down the other. Nobody comes up unless they really want to see you. They don't wander in and out saying, did you see this in the morning paper?
The New York Times, November 4th, 1928. As Miss Mead's careful scientific work deserves the most earnest tribute, so her method of presenting its results calls for the highest praise.
When I wrote my first book, Coming of Age in Samoa, it was about adolescence. And I thought that the people who were interested in adolescence were primarily teachers, and then to some extent physicians also. And they didn't speak Samoan, and they didn't speak technical anthropological language. And so I wrote it in English.
Mead's book broke two unwritten rules. She wrote in a popular style, and she suggested applications for the West, ways that American parents and teachers might reduce the tensions of growing up. Despite her more conventional academic publications, many of her colleagues were displeased. 30 years later, another curator at the museum would face the same problem.
I'd been at the museum about a year when I finished my first book, which was on the forest people in Mbuti. It was written for the public rather than for the academics. Margaret was asked to write something about it. She was very enthusiastic, and she warned me about the dangers of writing a book that was likely to be successful in any way. That if the book made money, people would be jealous. That if it gained any kind of fame or notoriety, people would be jealous, and that it could adversely affect a career and could lead to a great deal of unpopularity amongst one's colleagues.
Margaret and Luther had each changed direction, and childless, they were divorced in 1927.
Margaret's dissatisfaction was not with me. It was with marriage. Margaret, I don't think, could make the kind of commitment that was necessary for a prolonged, lasting, successful marriage. Her first commitment was to her profession, her work. I've always said she was programmed for greatness from the very beginning, at least distinction, and I think she carried it out, quite frankly. She played to that tune.
Luther left the ministry and went on to a second 50-year marriage and a distinguished career studying and teaching the archaeology of the Northwest.